The customer asked if the aisle with no end had reopened. He said it quietly, like he was asking for cigarettes behind the counter. Like it was something normal, something people asked for every night. I looked up from the register. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The store hummed with refrigerator motors and fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Half the bulbs along the back wall had been flickering all week, turning the aisles into alternating bands of pale white and shadow. The man stood at the counter with a plastic basket in his hands. Nothing inside it. His coat was zipped all the way up to his throat even though the heating vents were running. "I'm sorry," I said. He glanced over his shoulder toward the aisles. Then he leaned closer. "The aisle with no end," he said again. "Did they reopen it?" I stared at him. "We've got 12 aisles," I said. "None of them don't end." He gave a tight, humorless smile. "They used to close it off. Yellow tape, maintenance signs. Sometimes they moved the shelves so you couldn't see it." I waited. The refrigerators along the back wall kicked on with a low mechanical sigh. He tapped his fingers against the basket handle. "You'd know," he said finally, "if it was open." Then he put the empty basket on the counter and walked out of the store. The automatic doors slid shut behind him with a soft hydraulic thud. For a while, I just stood there. Late shifts did strange things to people. I'd heard customers insist we sold things we'd never stocked before. Brands that didn't exist, flavors nobody had ordered. But aisle with no end was new. I leaned over the counter and looked down the store. 12 aisles. Same as always. Long rows of shelves under tired fluorescent light. Cereal, canned soup, paper towels, cleaning supplies. Everything ordinary. Everything ending exactly where it should. I shook my head and went back to counting the drawer. About 10 minutes later, the lights flickered. Not the usual flicker. This one moved. It passed across the ceiling from the back of the store toward the front like something drifting through the electrical lines. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The sound faded again. When I looked up, the aisles seemed darker than before. I stood there listening. The refrigerators hummed. The ventilation system rattled softly in the ceiling. Somewhere deeper in the store, something shifted. A small plastic sound, like a box settling on a shelf. I sighed and stepped out from behind the counter. "Hello," I called. My voice moved down the aisles and came back thinner. The store smelled faintly of cardboard and floor cleaner. I walked toward the back. Aisle 7. Canned vegetables. Everything perfectly lined up. Aisle 8. Pet food. Dry kibble bags stacked like quiet boulders. Aisle 9. Cleaning supplies. The fluorescent light above it flickered once, then steadied. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something strange about aisle 10. It looked longer than it should. Not dramatically longer, just deeper. The shelves seemed to continue farther than the others before reaching the back wall. I stepped closer. The sign above it read, 10 baking goods. Flour, sugar, chocolate chips. Normal. But the aisle stretched farther than the others beside it. Maybe the perspective was weird. The overhead light flickered again. The far end of the aisle dimmed slightly. I walked in. The wheels of my shoes squeaked faintly on the tile floor. Flour bags on the left. Cooking oil on the right. The shelves smelled faintly sweet. Powdered sugar and vanilla extract. I walked a little farther. The shelves repeated. Same brands. Same boxes. I frowned. That wasn't unusual in a grocery store. Inventory was often stocked in repeating blocks. Still, something about it felt off. The light behind me flickered. I glanced back. The entrance to the aisle looked farther away than it should. Not dramatically, just enough to make the distance feel wrong. I took another step. The lights buzzed. The air felt colder here. And then I noticed something else. The shelves were repeating perfectly. Same flour bag with a small tear in the corner. Same crooked price label beneath it. I reached out and turned the bag slightly. The cardboard shelf edge rasped under my fingers. I walked 3 more steps. Another identical bag. Same tear. Same crooked label. I stopped moving. The air in the aisle felt still. Too still. Behind me, something ticked. One of the fluorescent lights dimmed. The back of the aisle stretched into deeper shadow. I turned around. The entrance looked farther now. Not impossibly far. Just further. Like the aisle had quietly grown while I wasn't looking. My throat tightened. I started walking back. The shelves slid past me in repeating blocks of flour and sugar. The light flickered again. Halfway down the aisle, the air moved. A faint cold draft brushed against my face. It came from deeper in the aisle. Not from the store. From the direction that kept stretching away. I stopped again. The store behind me was silent. Too silent. Even the refrigerators seemed distant now. I turned my head slowly. The deeper end of the aisle was darker than before. The shelves there blurred slightly, like heat haze. Except the air was cold. Very cold. I took one careful step toward it. The light above me buzzed. Another step. Something shifted farther down. A soft scraping sound. Like a box being dragged across metal shelving. I froze. "Hello," I said quietly. The word traveled down the aisle. Came back wrong. The echo took longer than it should have. And when it returned, it sounded like someone else saying it. Softer. Further away. "Hello." The shelves ahead looked longer again. I stared. The flour bags repeated. Again. 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 Same tear. Same crooked label. I stepped backward. Immediately the light behind me brightened. The aisle shortened slightly. I stopped. The light dimmed again. The shelves ahead stretched deeper. A slow realization settled in my stomach. The aisle wasn't just long. It was reacting. When I looked deeper, it grew. When I moved forward, it opened. When I stepped back, it shrank. The air in front of me shifted again. Colder gust this time. Something moved in the darkness between the shelves. Not walking, sliding. Like attention itself was pulling it closer. My chest tightened. I turned around and walked quickly toward the entrance. The lights brightened with each step. The shelves stopped repeating. The front of the aisle appeared suddenly, closer than it should have been. 3 steps later, I was back in the open store. I stood there breathing. Behind me, aisle 10 looked completely normal. The back wall was visible. A solid gray surface beneath a humming fluorescent bulb. The shelves ended exactly where they were supposed to. No darkness. No depth. No repeating flour bags. Just a regular aisle. I laughed once, softly. Then stopped. Because the sign above it no longer said 10 baking goods. It said something else. The plastic numbers had changed. The label strip had been replaced with plain white tape. Written across it in black marker were 3 words. Aisle closed. A narrow strip of yellow caution tape had appeared across the entrance. I hadn't seen anyone put it there. The tape hung loosely between the shelves, swaying slightly in a cold draft. From somewhere deep inside the aisle, I stepped closer. The lights flickered again. The back wall looked farther away than before. Just slightly. I stared at the tape. And then I noticed something written on the inside of the shelf beside it. Not marker. Not printed. Scratched into the metal. Words. Hundreds of them. Layered over each other. Some were faint. Some fresh. All saying the same thing. Turn back. I stepped away slowly. The tape rustled behind me. By the time I reached the counter again, the store lights had steadied. The aisles looked normal. 12 rows. All ending exactly where they should. At 3:15, another customer came in. A woman in a gray coat. She wandered the aisles for a minute before approaching the register. She placed a single bottle of water on the counter. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were tired. Nervous. "Sorry," she said quietly. "I know it's a strange question." My stomach tightened. She glanced toward the back of the store, then leaned closer. "Has the aisle with no end reopened?" Behind her, somewhere in the store, a fluorescent light flickered, and the sound echoed farther than it should have. The store's floor tiles rearranged themselves into a perfect maze. At first, I thought I was tired. Night shift does that to you. The fluorescent lights buzz all night, and the refrigeration units hum like distant engines. After a few hours, the store starts to feel unreal, like a place assembled out of repeating pieces. White tile, gray tile, white tile again. I was mopping near the frozen food aisle when I noticed the pattern had changed. The tiles near the entrance used to run in straight rows, white squares bordered by dull gray grout. I'd stared at them every night for months. But now the line bent, just slightly. At first it looked like a trick of the mop water. The thin film on the floor reflected the ceiling lights in wavy streaks. I stepped closer. The white row curved left. I frowned. That wasn't possible. Tiles don't move. I crouched and wiped the water away with my sleeve. The grout line underneath really was crooked now, bending like a slow river through the floor. A cold draft slid across the back of my neck. The front door was closed. The open 24 hours sign glowed quietly in the window. No one else was inside. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the crooked line. The refrigeration compressors kicked on behind me with a low mechanical thrum. Somewhere deeper in the store, a shelf creaked. Then something clicked. A faint sound, like ceramic settling. I looked down. A single tile shifted. It was small, barely a twitch. But I saw it. The square nudged sideways, just enough to tighten the seam between it and the next tile. My stomach tightened. I told myself the floor was expanding. Old buildings did that. Still, I took a step back. The tile moved again. Not sliding this time, rotating. The grout lines twisted until the square aligned with the curved row beside it. And then it stopped. The pattern was clean again. Intentional. My breath came out slowly. I laughed once under my breath, the sound thin in the empty store. Okay, I muttered. I went back to mopping. But when I reached the end of the aisle, the floor looked different again. Where the tiles had run straight toward the snack shelves, the rows now bent sharply to the right. Like a corridor, I stood still. The humming refrigerators seemed louder now, filling the silence with a heavy mechanical pulse. I turned toward the front entrance. The tile rows there had shifted too. They curved away from the door, splitting into narrow paths that slipped between the aisles. It wasn't random. The floor had organized itself into corridors. A maze. I walked toward the entrance anyway. My shoes tapped lightly on the ceramic squares. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed farther than it should have, bouncing between shelves of chips and soda. Halfway to the door, the lights flickered. Just once. The store dipped into gray shadow. When the lights steadied again, the tile path ahead of me had turned sharply left. The door was no longer straight ahead. I stared. That wasn't where the aisle had been. I turned around. The path behind me had narrowed. 2 rows of cereal shelves leaned slightly inward, the gap between them barely wide enough for a shopping cart. A faint scraping sound slid through the store. I looked down. The tiles were moving again. Not fast, just slow enough that you could miss it if you blinked. Squares gliding into new positions. Grout lines bending. The path behind me folded inward like a closing hallway. I felt something deep in my chest go cold. I stepped forward. The path curved left, then right, then split into 2 narrow lanes between displays of canned soup. I chose the one leading toward the entrance lights. My footsteps echoed strangely. The deeper I walked, the longer the echoes became. Tap, 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 as if someone else was stepping half a second after me. I stopped. The echo stopped too. The refrigeration hum seemed farther away now. The air felt colder. A draft slipped through the aisles, carrying the faint smell of cardboard and floor cleaner. I turned the corner. The entrance wasn't there. Instead, another aisle stretched ahead. Rows of bottled water stacked higher than they should have been. The tile path forked again. Behind me, something shifted. I turned quickly. The corridor I'd come from had sealed itself. Tiles pressed together, forming a solid wall of white squares between the shelves. My pulse jumped. "Hello," I called. My voice traveled strangely through the maze. The words stretched thin and hollow. "Hello, low, low." I started walking faster. The aisles kept bending. Snack shelves turned at wrong angles. Coolers sat where the checkout counter should have been. Every turn led deeper into the store. The ceiling lights flickered more often now. Each time they dimmed, the maze rearranged itself slightly. Paths stretched. Corners appeared where there hadn't been any. At one intersection, I stopped and listened. Beyond the hum of machines, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. Somewhere deeper in the maze. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then I noticed something on the floor. A scuff mark. Dark rubber against white tile. A shoe print. Not mine. It led down a narrow path between two freezer units. I followed it. The maze seemed to welcome that choice. The tiles ahead aligned neatly as I approached, forming a clear corridor. Behind me, the grout lines shifted, sealing the path I'd just used. The air grew colder. My breath fogged faintly in the fluorescent light. Another footprint appeared. Then another. Some were faded, old. At the next corner, the footprints multiplied. Dozens of them. Different sizes. Some small. Some heavy. They wandered the floor in confused loops before stopping abruptly near a dead end of stacked soda crates. I stared at the wall of tiles there. No exit. Just white squares. And scratches. Thin lines carved into the ceramic. Someone had tried to dig. The lights flickered again. The maze shifted. A new corridor opened beside the dead end. I stepped back. The footprints led into that corridor too. All of them. The mechanical hum around me deepened, vibrating through the shelves and the floor. I felt the tiles move under my feet, not just sliding, breathing, expanding slightly when I stood still, tightening when I turned. Like the maze was watching, reacting. I tried running. The corridors twisted instantly, forcing me into tighter turns. The store stretched endlessly around me. More aisles, more coolers, more corners. No entrance. No windows. Just the maze. Time blurred. The lights flickered so often that the store pulsed between brightness and shadow. At some point, I realized the footprints weren't just old. Some were fresh. Barely visible impressions of dust on the tiles. As if someone had walked here minutes ago, or was walking here now. I turned slowly. The corridor behind me was longer than before. Far down it, something moved. A shape passing between shelves. Not fast. Just walking. The lights flickered again. The shape vanished. The tiles shifted under my shoes, gently guiding me forward. Another turn. Another corridor. More footprints. More scratches on the floor. And then I saw the front counter. The register glowed softly. Exactly where it should have been. Relief rushed through me so suddenly I laughed. I walked toward it. The tiles stayed still this time. The maze opened politely, forming a straight path to the counter. The register screen blinked awake. Welcome. I stepped behind the counter. The maze stopped moving. The store fell quiet again. For a long time I just stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerators. Eventually I looked down at the floor. The tiles were back in perfect rows. White, gray, white, like nothing had happened. I almost believed it, until I noticed the footprints. They circled the counter. Dozens of them. Layers upon layers of old scuff marks looping endlessly around the register. All facing inward. All stopping right where I was standing. And when the lights flickered one more time, the tiles behind the counter shifted slightly, closing the only path away.